should be good, right? Yeah, should be good enough, bro. Yeah, cool. Thank you so much, bro. Oh no. Good gear? Oh no. No, I haven't.
Tôi bây giờ gì? Tôi sớm cái gì?
Ủa? Oh no, thank you. That's a good point. I'll just come a bit back. Hare Krishna, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the manor and having the darshan of the deities. Right now, we are beginning with the Gita class. So, in that case, what normally happens is when you have Gita class, the audience is seated in the front, this side, and the idea is that obviously we can interact during the session and thus see all the people. So I was just hoping if you could slightly move a bit this side. Cool. Thank you so much. So normally before we begin a Gita class, we sing Jai Radha Madhav. How many of you have heard of that Kirtan before? Okay, it's pretty simple. So I'll sing and then you can follow along as well. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradhari Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradhari Yashoda Nandana Brajajana Ranjana Yashoda Nandana Brajajana Ranjana Yamuna Tira Vanachari Yamuna Tira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradhari Yashodanandana Braja Jana Ranjana Yamuna Tira Vanachari Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Jaya Radha Gokulananda Radha Gokulananda Shri Radhe Jaya Sita Ram Lakshman Hanuman Sita Ram Jaya Lakshman Hanuman Jaya Jaya Prabhupada Prabhupada Jaya Jaya Prabhupada Nitya Gaura Hari Bol Hari Bol Hari Bol Nitya Okay, thank you everyone. We'll now proceed with our class. And today we are speaking on the third chapter of the Gita. And this is the last verse of the Gita. So, if you're not aware of the format, the way it works is first I'll recite the verse and then you can follow through. And then if you feel motivated, go for it. You can also try it out. So, Bhagavad Gita 3.43. So I'll say the first line and then you can follow through. Is that good? Good. Evam buddhe param buddhva. Evam buddhe param buddhva. Samstabhyatmanamatmana. Samstabhyatmanamatmana. Jahi Shatrum Mahabaho. Jahi Shatrum Mahabaho. Kamarupam Durasadam. Kamarupam Durasadam. Evam buddhe param buddhva. Samtabhyatmanamatmana. Jahi Shatrum Mahabaho. Kamarupam Durasadam. Okay, so any Prabhujis, would you like to try? Go for it. Evam buddhe param buddhva. Samstabhyatmana atmana. Jahi Satru Mahabaho. Kamarupam Durasadam. Thank you. Any other Prabhujis? Would you like to try, bro? Evam buddhe param buddhva. Samstabhyatmanamatmana. Jahi Shatrum Mahabaho. Kamarupam Durasadam. Thank you, Prabhu. Matajis? Evam buddhe param buddhva. Samstadhyatmanamatmana. Jahi Shatrum Mahabaho. Kamarupam Durashadam. Thank you. Evam buddhe param buddhva. Samstabhyatmanamatmana. Jahi Shatrum Mahabaho. Kamarupam Durasadam. Thank you. Okay, we'll go with the translation. So I'll repeat the translation and you can also repeat as well. Thus, knowing oneself to be transcendental to the material senses, mind and intelligence. O mighty armed Arjuna, one should study the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence, Krishna consciousness, and thus by spiritual strength conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. Okay. Thus knowing oneself to be transcendental to the material senses, mind and intelligence. O mighty armed Arjuna, one should study the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence, Krishna consciousness, and thus by spiritual strength conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. Purport. The third chapter of the Bhagavad Gita is conclusively directive to Krishna consciousness by knowing oneself as the eternal servitor of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, without considering impersonal voidness the ultimate end. In the material existence of life, one is certainly influenced by propensities for lust and desire, for dominating the resources of material nature. Desire for overloading and for sense gratification is the greatest enemy of the conditioned soul. But by the strength of Krishna consciousness, one can control the material senses, the mind, and the intelligence. One may not give up work and prescribed duties all of a sudden, but by gradually developing Krishna consciousness, one can be situated in a transcendental position without being influenced by the material senses and the mind, by steady intelligence directed towards one pure identity. This is the sum total of this chapter. In the immature stage of material existence, philosophical speculations and artificial attempts to control the senses by the so called practice of yogic postures can never help a man towards spiritual life. He must be trained in Krishna consciousness by high intelligence. Now, before I begin the class, I'll just recite some invocation prayers. And the idea is to express gratitude to our teachers who have given us this profound wisdom. So, in your minds, you can think of anyone you're grateful for today, where you are in your life. And if you know the prayers, feel free to join along as well. ॐ अज्ञानतिमिरान्धस्य ज्ञानञ्जनशलाखया चक्षुरुन्मिलितं येन तस्मै श्रीगुरवे नमः श्रीचैतन्यमनोभीष्टं स्थापितं येन भूतले स्वयं रूपगदामह्यं ददाति स्वपदान्तिकं वन्देऽहं श्रीगुरो श्रीयुतपदकमलं श्रीगुरून् वैष्णवांश्च रूपं साग्रजातं सहगण रघुनाथान्वितं तं सजीवं साद्वैतं सावधूतं परिजनसहितं कृष्णचैतन्यदेवं श्रीराधाकृष्णपादान् सहगण ललिता श्रीविशाखान्वितांश्च हे कृष्ण करुणा सिन्धु दीनबन्धु जगत्पते गोपेश गोपिकान्त राधाकान्त नमोऽस्तु ते तप्तकाञ्चन गौरांगी राधे वृंदावनेश्वरी वृषभानुसुते देवी प्रणमामि हरिप्रिये वाञ्छाकल्पतरुभ्यश्च कृपा सिन्धुभ्य एव च पतितानां पावनेभ्यो वैष्णवेभ्यो नमो नमः जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर शिवासादि गौरभक्तवृंद हरे कृष्णा कृष्ण कृष्ण हरे 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 राम 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 हरे हरे. Thank you for being assembled here. First of all, I would like to take all your blessings from all the devotees that are assembled here, as well as the devotees online. Since this is the last verse of the third chapter, just to give you a bit of a context, like what the whole third chapter is all about, I thought I'll give you a brief summary of that. So, and just to easily remember the third chapter as well, which is entitled Karma Yoga, I'll give you a few acronyms. So that way we can understand what's going on, what's the context. So, initially with third chapter, it began with the concept of tyag or detachment. And this is verses 1 to 9. And here we see Arjuna display the confusion of immature spiritualist. And sometimes even when we go to book distribution, where we try to preach Krishna consciousness to people who have no idea of like what's the essence of spirituality, normally they will say things like, why don't you just work? Well, what are you doing giving all these books? Do something practical regarding life. And the amazing thing is Arjuna also shows a similar sentiment. He says to Krishna, why are you engaging me in this ghastly warfare? How will we benefit by killing so many people? But Krishna here teaches us that spirituality, it's not about renunciation. It's more about how we can integrate it in our day-to-day lives. And in the world today, we see we entail so many awkward dealings with money, possessions, people, and career, to name but a few. So generally people have the notion that spirituality is incompatible with a material lifestyle. But Krishna explains that true renunciation is not merely abandoning external activities. True renunciation is to give up the mentality that one is the controller and enjoyer of all his deeds. So the idea is that no, Krishna is saying that yes, we should work hard, we should be diligent with our work, but we should do it as an offering to Krishna, knowing that Krishna is the ultimate enjoyer and controller. And there's a very prominent verse in Bhagavad Gita in the 9th chapter which says, Yat karoshi yad ashnasi yad juhosi dadasi yat tapasyasi kaunteya tat kurusva madarpanam. And the translation implies whatever you do, whatever you eat, whatever you offer or give away, and whatever austerities you perform, do that, O son of Kunti, as an offering to me. So isn't it wonderful that, generally when we think of Krishna consciousness, we see it so practical, right? Like all we need to do is just offer something to Krishna. So if we are working, for example, we can, contribute to maybe like through some donations to the temple, or even just visiting to the temple on weekends like you all have done here. And then if we make even like some food, it's as simple as just offering the food to Krishna first, given that he has given us so much resources and so much happiness in life. So it's as simple as that. And there's another story which explains this theme. And how many of you have heard of Narad Muni, the transcendental spaceman? Yeah, he's quite the character, right? So in this past time, once Narad Muni, known for his spiritual acumen, he saw Vishnu, and seeking improvement, he asked the Lord to identify the greatest devotee. And surprisingly, Vishnu pointed out to a simple farmer who was just engaged in his daily work. Now, Narad Muni was completely perplexed and shocked, and he thought, that of all the people that Krishna could choose, he chose this farmer. Why? What about all those illustrious sages who sacrifice everything, who forsake everything that they have just to try to realize Krishna? But for Krishna to explain that to Narad Muni, he gave him a simple task. He gave Narad Muni a bowl filled with oil, and he said to carry it around the universe and back without spilling a single drop. Now, obviously, this would be difficult, right? And Narad Muni set off with full determination to accomplish the task. And when he came back, he managed to do the task successfully. But then Krishna asked him that whilst you were walking, did you remember and think of me? And Narad thought humbly, well, the task was difficult as it is, and balancing the pot and simultaneously remembering I wasn't able to manage that. So the Lord just pointed out, look at the simple farmer. He has so many responsibilities. He has a job. He's growing food for not just himself, but for the wider society. He has a family. He has so many responsibilities. But despite all that, he's constantly chanting my names. So even obviously in today's life, I'm assuming most of you are working. And we know it's difficult. We know that it takes a lot of time, dedicating so much time to obviously our work, to also support our family. But at the end, if you're able to just give some offering to Krishna, or just even remember Krishna, that could be either chanting a few rounds during your free time, or even giving some service, which I'm sure a lot of you do. That ultimately is what matters at the end of the day. So this shows us an important lesson of how spirituality is more about integration. And real renunciation, as Krishna says, it's about giving up the greed, selfishness, and envy that causes us to utilize material things in a self-centered and exploitative way. So yeah, the idea is everything in our life, whether it's our work, family, possessions, they can ultimately be used for Krishna's service. And the idea is that spiritualists, instead of owning things, we are not owned by things, but we just try to use those things in Krishna's service. So that was the first 9 verses of chapter 3. And then the next verses, 10 to 6, you can remember it through the letter R. So the acronym I'll give you is TREE. So the first T represents tyag or detachment. The second R represents rungs on a ladder. So you might say ladder, it has those different things which help you climb. And in this verses, from 10 to 16 verses, Krishna describes different level of spiritual progression. And the first aspect is of karma kanda. Now, the amazing thing is, the Vedas are so broad and vast, but surprisingly, I think over 97%, majority of it is actually based on karma kanda, or like how you can actually enjoy in this material world. And that could be whether it's attracting a partner, or being rich, or just doing rituals. But beyond that, say something higher, which Krishna describes as sakama karma yoga, which means that yes, you still enjoy in the world, but you also want to connect spirituality, because you see that despite all this opulence and wealth, you're missing something, right? And that's why Krishna says that yes, like you still offer something to him, but you still live a relatively material life. And beyond that is even a higher stage, Nishkama Karma Yoga, which we are aspiring to get to, is giving everything and connecting spiritually. And this is a very high point, because ultimately you're just doing everything for Krishna service. So these verses basically describe the different progression of how we translate from Karma Kanda and eventually and hopefully get to Nishkama Karma Yoga. Now the third one, the third acronym is E, which represents which represents exemplary. So we talked about tree, right? So tyag, rungs of a ladder, and an exemplary. And by exemplary, we see that with Gita, it emphasizes on a lot of character development. And there's a prominent verse in Bhagavad Gita 3.21. You might have heard of this. Yad yad achariti shreshtas tat tat eva tarojana sayad pramanam gurute lokas tad anuvartade. And it's very powerful. It implies that whatever action a great man performs, common man follow. And whatever standards he sets by exemplary acts, all the world pursues. And again, it delves into the notion about how it is important to be exemplary in our character, especially when we are trying to be a devotee of Krishna, when we are trying to be dear to Krishna. And a prominent example of this is, you might have heard of, how many of you have heard of George Harrison by any chance? I mean, yeah, I guess the monastery that you're here is donated by him, so we owe him a lot. And he was actually a very prominent Beatles musician. And initially, when he met our founder, Acharya Srila Prabhupada, he was so inspired that he wanted to become a full-time monk, actually. This is one thing we say when we do book distribution. We had this prominent musician who wanted to become a full-time monk. But Prabhupada said, you're already a musician, right? You have so much impact in today's world. People look up to you. And through music, you can actually make a bigger difference to people and transform their lives more positively. So again, it's showing the principle of how, spirituality is more about integration rather than detachment, renunciation. And even Krishna, through his example, we see, Krishna, the supreme personality of Godhead, he could have just relaxed or thought okay, I'm God, I don't need to do anything. But he himself, Krishna, when he came as Lord Ramachandra, he had a teacher, right? Vasishta Muni. And then later Vishwamitra Muni. And then even Krishna, in his pastime, he accepted a spiritual teacher, Sandipani Muni. So even Krishna himself, he's showing that, it's important to lead by character. Preach what you practice. And this is very important, that even God himself shows that. Otherwise, what example are you setting? So this is a really good point. And lastly, which will come to this main chapter, and the main theme, as you can see, is lust. And with that, the last acronym is enemy. So we have Tyaga, which is detachment, R, rungs on a ladder, exemplary, the third E, and the final E is enemy. And this enemy talks about lust. So this is a very prominent verse in the Gita. In the 37th verse of this chapter, Arjun asks, oh Krishna, what is it that impels one to sinful activities, even they don't want to do it? How many of you can relate to this? Sometimes when you have a deep, you want to do something, but you end up doing something else. And you feel like that's something beyond your control. That's not truly you. And that could be things like, I mean, I've been a student, so procrastination is one of the things, right? Like when you know you have to get work done, but you just leave it in the last minute. And every time you tell yourself you won't do that, but you end up doing it anyways. So that's one aspect, right? What is it that makes us, like we complacent, we lazy, we, against our best intentions? And Krishna actually says that it is lust only, Arjuna, which is born of contact with the material mode of passion. And this is later transformed into wrath or anger. And this is the all devouring sinful enemy of the world. So Krishna really emphasizes that lust is, it's a very serious impediment in our devotional service. Now, just out of curiosity, obviously I've heard the terms of lust and love. Now, I'll just open it up a bit. What do you think is the difference between lust and love? Any volunteers? Anything? What do you think of lust when you first think of it? Oh, yes, something what you want. Thank you so much. And yeah, like you said, it's about, like taking, expecting, enjoying. And anything else? You think of the word lust? Desire, yes. Thank you so much. Yes, it's about like satisfying our desires. And sometimes it can be a bit selfish behavior. Shri Shri Radha Gokulananda ki, Sita Ram Lakshman Hanuman ki, Gaurnitai ki, Jai Prabhupada ki. Okay, thank you so much. And okay, now let's move on to the other side of the coin. Love. What do you think of love when you hear the word? Krishna. Oh, that's you hit the essence. Krishna. Yes, thank you. Like serving Krishna. Anything else?
Even the feeling to do something or give someone you love.
Yeah, like you said it. You explained it very beautiful. Thank you so much. You said, with lust it's about taking. With love it's about giving. Yeah. And you wanted to mention that? Okay, similar. Thank you. And yeah, love is like appreciating, giving, serving, right? It's more about the other person rather than yourself. And it's more long lasting and ultimately it's selfless. It comes from a place of service rather than lust, which is more about like enjoying. So, as Mataji mentioned, in one sense, you actually answered the point. Like, so first, with lust, we'll see it from a philosophical aspect and we'll discuss on it on a more practical level. Okay? So, first of all, what is lust and what is love? What do the scriptures say? So, in Chaitanya Charitamrit, there's a very beautiful verse. Atmendriya priti vancha tare balikam, Krishnendriya priti ichha dhare premanam. And this basically, like, in essence, it explains the difference between love and lust in a very simple way. The desire to gratify one's senses is kama, lust. But the desire to please the senses of Lord Krishna is prema, love. As simple as that. Obviously, easier, more difficult to implement than just thinking about it. But yeah, it shows that initially, like even the second chapter of the Gita describes, when it describes the soul, we have our innate nature consists of three characteristics: Sat, Chid, Ananda, which implies love, bliss, and eternity. And the idea is that it's something that's our nature. Like, we are meant to love. We are meant to be happy. We are meant to live, like till basically we don't die. That's the characteristic of the soul, which we are. But what happens in the material world is, obviously we see that these things are difficult. Why is it so difficult that we are not able to recognize our innate characteristic, right? Why does the thought of death make us very uncomfortable? And the idea is that love actually transforms into lust when it comes in contact with the material world. And Jagatpriya Mataji gave a very beautiful class yesterday where she was mentioning the analogy that milk is transformed into yogurt. So that's the idea, that when love is in touch with material world, it becomes lust. And the few analogies. One in the Gita it mentions that as fire is covered by smoke, and as a mirror is covered by dust, or as the embryo is covered by the womb, the living entity is similarly covered by different degrees of lust. And even with this analogies, like the beauty is that it shows us that, like for different species, they have a higher level of lust. For example, for trees, they practically have no consciousness, right? And then beyond that is animals and beasts who have like a high level of consciousness, but they still, like what's the difference between humans and animals? Anyone? Sorry? Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much. Yes? Okay, that's a good one. Don't sleep in bed. So, wow. You're very smart. Thank you. Yeah, so like you mentioned it's that innate ability to inquire, to be curious, right? Animals won't think about like, why am I in this world? What's my purpose? They are, whatever nature has given them, they act accordingly. Whereas with humans, we have this option, right? We can inquire like, okay, why am I here in this first place? Why is there so much suffering in this world? Ask these deeper questions, be more curious, right? So the idea is that even with lust, that we are covered by lesser extent to other species. And in one sense, we should take advantage of this fact, because the way the scriptures say that there are actually 8.4 million species. And out of that, to get a human birth is very rare. I think only like 400,000 species, if I'm not mistaken, are like related to humans. So it's something very rare, right? And sometimes we just take it for granted, like, oh, I'm a human, but we could be anything, literally. So the idea is obviously to inquire about these deeper things and ultimately realize like what's our purpose in this world. So again, with this lust, the idea is that it sits in the places of the senses, the mind, and the intelligence. And as a result, it's very difficult to overcome it. But Krishna says that the soul is even higher than the intelligence. And the idea is that ultimately we are the souls. It's just about developing that practice so that we are able to have a better realization of this. So again, that's just the theory, right? The reality is difficult, let's be honest. And again, with lust, it's the idea that we expect something in return. And every aspect of our life, right? There is some lust. Like, would you, like just, because obviously most of you are working, right? Would you work if your employer, like, did not give you a salary? No, right? Because we have an expectation. Yeah, if I'm putting my hard work in, I better get paid. So that's the thing, right? And it's actually described that in the Gita that, I think Prabhupada says this, that the highest form of love in this material world is the love between a mom and the child. Because that's very selfless. So, where there's just without any intention or motive, right? So that's the thing. Like, it's something that's predominant in our world, right? And it's difficult to overcome. Bhagavatam says, like, it's the attraction between man and woman that drives the world. And there's a very prominent story by Srila Prabhupada, like, when he came to one of the American cities, I believe it was New York, and he saw, when you go to, like, Western countries, some of the things you'll see is, like, they have very tall buildings. And Srila Prabhupada was that, this city must have very beautiful women. And his disciples were thinking, what has women got to do with like big buildings? And Prabhupada was like, yeah, because the fact that they're building all these buildings is to impress the woman. So he just showed that point, that it's something very prominent, right? And again, it's difficult. Even in the Bhagavatam, we see like great devotees, great personalities, like Lord Brahma and Lord Shiva, who like are exemplary Vaishnavas. Even they fall prey to lust. Again, it's not about showing, obviously that's Leela, but at the point it's addressing the issue that this is something that should not be taken lightly. Like in the third canto, we see Lord Brahma becomes attracted to his own daughter. And similarly in the eighth canto, we see that, you might have heard of this, that Lord Vishnu appeared as Mohini Murti. And the idea was to bewilder the demons and distribute nectar to the demigods. However, Lord Shiva desired to see that form of Lord Krishna. And even he got agitated by Mohini Murti and he started chasing her. So, we should never think that we're immune to lust. Like, that's the biggest bewilderment you can have. Like, and it's something very like predominant. It's something that's, like I mentioned, it's an intense covering that we have. So what can we do? I mean, given that it is so difficult, right? And one aspect of it is obviously like doing spiritual practice. And with that, I'll give you a framework. So again, another acronym. So the first acronym was TREE for chapter 3. This acronym is cost. So I'll elaborate on each letter. So first is conviction. To truly overcome lust, first you need to have conviction. Then spirituality or like developing purity is something that is important. And how discipline and self-restraint will benefit you in the longer run. One of our teachers says, do not give up now. Do not like fall to your temptations, right? Always remember your underlying and deeper purpose in life. And again, purity is ultimately the force. Secondly, we need to have the conviction, but more important that we also need to be open, because the reality is like sometimes we will fail in our dealings, right? And with that, it's just important to have maybe a few close friends where you can be accountable and responsible to, so that they can also give you advice, support, and guidance, and also feedback, because there's no purity without honesty. And thirdly, safety implies like creating a space where you are not vulnerable to those temptations. And the formula is pretty simple. Prevention is the best cure, right? For example, if someone is struggling with alcohol, so the best bet for them is basically not to go to like a drinking place, right? Because that's where they're vulnerable. So the idea is like, if you know your weaknesses, and this could be to any habits that you might have, which you want to avoid or you want to overcome, like just try to avoid those environments where you feel you're more vulnerable. And lastly, and most importantly, is developing taste. And that's about engaging in our spiritual life, because the idea is when you do spiritual service, when you do bhakti, when you engage in chanting, the idea is that not only does it purify, not does it only cleanse your heart, but ultimately it helps you develop in the most profound relationship between you and Krishna. And through that, when we get a higher taste, it automatically helps us overcome our lower temptations. So that's the idea, like, because ultimately, since we are the soul, right? It's about reestablishing that ultimately we are the servants of Krishna, and it's investing in that relationship so that we can develop and be the best versions of ourselves. And again, with this, like, even like I mentioned, one of the points, like, prevention is the best cure. Again, I'll give the example of Lord Krishna, that in his most recent incarnation, you might have heard of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So even him, despite being like the supreme personality of Godhead, he would refrain from like seeing women alone. And the idea was that he was setting an ideal standard for sannyasis. That, like, even for God himself, he's just showing like, lust is something very prominent, very powerful. You have to take it with caution, And again, with that, obviously at the same time, like there's a fine balance of both, right? So it shouldn't be the case like if you're a man and then you see some Mataji singing, I should be like, oh no, I won't. No, okay, let's be sensitive, right? So maybe I'll just give a story that will help you explain like the essence of the principle. So a very interesting anecdote is given about two monks, and they offer a deep insight about like how we can develop the spiritual principles. So when they reached like a river bank, they saw a beautiful lady. Obviously, monks, being celibate monks, that's one of the things they would like avoid. But they could see that she was quite stranded and she genuinely needed help. And because the river was quite high, the depth of the river, and the younger monk thought that, we are celibate monks and we should avoid and refrain from, helping, like, being in close association with women. So he just ignored her and quickly paced along, cautious not to compromise his strict vows of celibacy. But then the older monk, he saw that it was a desperate and dire situation, right? And as a result, he politely went over to the lady and he helped her. So what he did was, he requested her to climb over his shoulders, and then he took her across the river because she lacked the strength to do it on her own. And once they crossed the river, like he just helped her, and then they went their different paths. So after a while, whilst the two monks were again walking, the younger monk was quite disturbed, and he told the older monk, how could you, a shining emblem of celibacy, carry a woman on your shoulders? And he challenged this. But the older monk looked straight at the younger monk and said that, I only carried the woman for a few minutes across the river for an essential purpose. You, on the other hand, you have needlessly carried her in your mind for the last few hours. So it shows, the message was loud and clear that real renunciation is within. So that's one way. Now, another aspect that can help us overcome this insatiable enemy as lust is taking shelter of Krishna and being engaged in devotional service. And again, with this, even with this point, actually, there's a very popular pastime which Srila Prabhupada, the founder. So once when he was arriving on a plane, and obviously with Prabhupada, he had many disciples, right? So whenever he would leave a plane, there would be many devotees who would come to greet him and pick him up. So when he was walking, all of them, obviously, when they saw him, they bowed down. And then at that moment, Prabhupada told his secretary, this is what happens when you overcome lust. And then after a few minutes, Prabhupada again just spoke to his secretary. It's not that I have lust, it's just that I don't have time for lust. So this is a very important point. Obviously, Prabhupada, with his humility, he was just saying to, encourage people that, lust is very powerful. But the idea is very important because it shows us that, sometimes to defeat an enemy, you need to be honest about their strengths, right? And sometimes you just have to admit something like lust. Maybe I can't conquer it, but what I can do is instead, if I equip myself with so much service, with so much work, that I just don't have time for it, then that way, I would be able to mitigate it. So it offered us a very valuable insight. And we see another very popular pastime. And in Chaitanya Charitamrita, there's a character called Haridas Thakur. And he was again a very wonderful devotee of Lord Krishna. And given that he was very popular in preaching, and actually when you try to spread Krishna's glories, naturally sometimes you'll face opposition, let's face it. So again, what a few of the oppositions were trying to do was defeat him. So what they did was they sent a prostitute to try to bewilder him so that he would fall to his temptations. So when the prostitute approached him, she said that she wanted to satisfy her desires. And Haridas Thakur, being an exemplary Vaishnava, he said, all right, but first I need to complete my rounds and my chanting. And Haridas Thakur would chant 192 rounds every day. So obviously someone very advanced. And again, the point being that by the time he finished his rounds, he said, and he would come to the prostitute and say that, I'm sorry, I don't have time because I have rounds to complete. And this would repeat again. But it just addresses the same point. Sometimes with lust, the best way to mitigate it, basically, just have such a work ethic. Be engaged in so much devotional service, including obviously your work as well, that you just don't have time for it, right? Because then that way, it helps you mitigate that. So again, it showed a very powerful example. And even this pastime also shows us another important aspect, is the power of association. Given that Haridas Thakur was such an exemplary devotee, the prostitute in fact became a devotee. Imagine someone even of a prostitute's background was able to, uplift her character and uplift her consciousness. And this shows us, association is so key. So even here in the manor, we organize Be a Monk challenges. And it's a very insightful and valuable experience. Obviously, we know that all of you are working and it might be difficult. But personally, I have stayed in the monastery for 6 months as a monk. And I'll be very honest, it's very transformative. The discipline and the clarity that it offers you is truly life-changing. So yeah, obviously with work it's difficult, but we do have 1 week Be a Monk challenges. So if you're free, please do sign up, and then experience the monk life yourself 1 week, and trust me, you'll notice the change. Like, it's very powerful. So yeah, that's the essence of it. That, lust is something very powerful, and it's difficult. Like, even in today's world, we see, like, something, for example, like cigarette consumption. We see that initially when cigarettes came, the message was smoking may damage your health. Later, it was edited. Tobacco causes cancer. And even now, it's smoking kills. So the message has given more powerful. But the funny thing is that consumption has increased. So, it's a difficult cycle to break through, right? So the important idea is that we just have to be very honest. And yeah, ultimately, it's about taking shelter, right? Because Krishna is beyond every material aspect. So again, with that, there's a very beautiful verse in the 7th chapter of the Gita, which says, Devi Hesha Gunamai Mama Maya Duratyaya Mam Eva Ye Prapadyante Mayam Eta Taranti Te. This divine energy of mine, consisting of the three modes of material nature, is difficult to overcome, but those who have surrendered unto me can easily cross beyond it. Because we need to remember that ultimately Maya Devi, or the material energy of the Lord, is still a devotee of Krishna. And she knows that this guy is genuinely trying, to be the best devotee that he can. So Krishna definitely, she'll try to challenge you. But again, if we are firm in taking shelter of Lord Krishna, ultimately Krishna will protect us. And again, in Bhagavatam, there's a very prominent verse which says, Shinvata Swakatha Krishna Punya Shavana Kirtana Hidyantastoya Badrani Vidunoti Surit Sata. And the essence of it is that see Krishna, the personality of Godhead, who is the Paramatma, supersoul in everyone's heart, and the benefactor of truthful devotee, cleanses desire for material enjoyment from the heart of the devotee, who has developed the urge to hear his messages, which are in themselves virtuous when properly heard and chanting. So ultimately, Krishna will help us. Like, we just have to take shelter of him. And when we surrender to him, Krishna can see that he can see that this is a devotee who is very genuine and sincere and who wants to grow in his spiritual life. And as a result, Krishna will help you. And I know we just talked about lust from I guess the sexual lust. But then another point that I wanted to address, even with lust, when it is satisfied, it leads to greed. And when it's not satisfied, it leads to anger. So it's described that there are actually 3 gates to hell: lust, greed, and anger. And again, in the Vedas, we observe this, right? These themes of greed and anger. Like in the Mahabharata, we see, how Dhritarashtra's greed for his son ultimately led to his downfall and led to so much misery, because attachment to family life without Krishna consciousness creates bondage. Don't get me wrong, it's important to love your family, but ultimately you have to see it as a responsibility that Krishna has given you these children. They are souls from many lifetimes, and ultimately your objective is to help them in their journey as well. And then again, we see the theme of anger, where in one of the pastimes in Bhagavatam, where Durvasa Muni basically tries to ambush Ambrish Maharaj. But then that backfires because the Lord does not tolerate, if his devotee is hurt. So yeah, again with that, with anger and greed, sometimes it's very easy to get tempted by that. But ultimately we have to remember that, it's between us and Krishna. There's a very prominent quote that I really like, and Mother Teresa said, so I hope it can offer some insight. So this is how the quote goes. People are often unreasonable and self-centered. Forgive them anyway. If you're kind, people may accuse you of ulterior motives. Be kind anyway. If you're honest, people may cheat you. Be honest anyway. If you find happiness, people may be jealous. Be happy anyway. The good you do today may be forgotten tomorrow. Do good anyway. Give your best anyway. For you see, in the end, it was never between you and them. It was between you and Krishna. So ultimately, it's understanding that. Again, easier said than done. But the idea is that when we invest in this relationship, it makes us self-satisfied. So whenever there's some external situations, we are able to be peaceful because we know that ultimately it's between us and Krishna. And just to finish off, Nelson Mandela, he said a very famous quote, and actually when he was offered a Gita, he said that he had actually read the Gita while he was in prison. And when asked what's the lesson he learned from it, he said that as I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I would still be in prison. So yes, the essence of it is obviously taking shelter of Krishna, being engaged in devotional service, and also like trying to getting the association of devotees, because through that we are ultimately able to inhabit their characteristics and just be the best version of ourselves. So I'm aware that we're a bit short on time. So maybe we can do one question. So does anyone have like any burning question that they wish to satisfy? Yes, Prabhu, go for it. Thank you.
I wanted to ask a question that is, like, no one is allowed to take anyone's life in this world of the reasons like Krishna. Are butchers who take the life of obviously animals doing what karma yoga as themselves? Are they sinful?
That's a good question. Yeah, because I can see what you mean. Like, in one sense, like that's their duty, right? I think with that, there are two ways to look at it. Like two scenarios. One with butchers, like, because naturally you can see, right? Like when you kill an animal, there's an insensitivity towards it. So the idea is that if, like, they had a choice in choosing their profession and they chose to be a butcher, then in that sense you would argue that it's fair, because why be engaged in such a ghastly work which makes you less insensitive, which makes you, devoid of compassion? So in that sense, yes, because it makes sense, because they could have chosen an occupation that's more in the mode of goodness, but clearly we see this is an act, that is quite brutal, let's be honest, like just taking away life. Now I'll give you another example. Let's say, someone is scheduled to be hanged to death, right? In that case, if someone is given responsibility of, I guess, like killing that person who has been sentenced to that, in that case they wouldn't incur the sin, because they are just doing their duty, right? They're just being an instrument. So again with sin, it's a very easy concept, but the idea is obviously when we preach, like we all obviously have to be compassionate to people, right? We have this access, we have this community, we have this